He has no backstory, no long genealogy to trace his roots, no father named, no mother mentioned. He walks onto the page of 1 Kings like a sudden lightning strike. The text simply introduces him as Elijah, the Tishbite. He arrives at one of the darkest spiritual moments in the history of Israel. The nation is deeply compromised. The throne is occupied by King Ahab, a ruler who the text says did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Alongside him is his wife, Queen Jezebel, who has systematically replaced the worship of the God of Israel with the worship of Baal. Baal was not just a generic ancient deity. He was believed to be the storm god, the rider of the clouds, the god who controlled the lightning, the rain, the dew, and the fertility of the soil. The culture believed that if the ground produced food, it was because Baal was providing it. And into this exact cultural moment, this prophet from Gilead walks directly into the royal court. He does not ask for an audience. He does not negotiate terms. He stands before the most powerful king of his day and speaks a single devastating sentence. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Notice what Elijah is doing. He is not just challenging a corrupt earthly king. He is openly mocking the false god of the state. By declaring that the rain and the dew will completely stop, Elijah is proving that Baal has absolutely no power over the skies. The God of Israel is the only one who commands the clouds. It is a moment of absolute spiritual triumph, a massive, undeniable display of prophetic authority. You would expect the very next verse to describe a national revival. You would expect Elijah to rally the people, march to the high places, and tear down the altars of Baal while the momentum is high. He has the power. He has the undeniable word of God. But that is not what God does. The very next instruction God gives to his prophet is not to march forward, but to disappear. 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 2 and 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Karath ravine, east of the Jordan. That sounds like a small, practical detail. It is not. Elijah has just shut the heavens. He has just brought the economy and the agriculture of an entire nation to a sudden, grinding halt. And the immediate result of his bold obedience is an order from God to run away and sit in total silence by a distant creek. Most readers look at this moment and assume it is purely about logistics. Ahab is furious. Jezebel is lethal. Elijah needs a safe house. We tend to read the story of the brook as nothing more than a story of physical preservation. God is simply protecting his prophet from assassination. God is putting him in the wilderness to keep him safe until the time is right to return to the public stage. But biblical geography is never just geography, and wilderness seasons in Scripture are never just waiting rooms. God was not merely hiding Elijah from Ahab. God was hiding Elijah from the applause, from the momentum, and from his own potential pride. There is a profound biblical pattern at work here. Before God uses someone publicly on the mountain, he always forms them privately in the wilderness. What happens next, at the Brook Cherith, is not just a story about a prophet seeking shelter from a wicked king. It is the story of God systematically dismantling a prophet's self-reliance before entrusting him with unprecedented public power. Most people think God sent Elijah to Cherith just to keep him safe, but the text reveals God was doing something much deeper to the prophet himself. And to understand what was really happening in that rocky ravine, we have to look closely at the ancient name of the brook itself. The geography of the Karath ravine tells us exactly what kind of season Elijah is entering. The text says the brook is located east of the Jordan. This is rugged, unforgiving, and desolate terrain. It is not a lush, green river valley. It is what the biblical world calls a wadi. A wadi is a dry, rocky gorge. It is a deep ravine that only flows with water when heavy rains fall in the distant mountains and run down through the desert cracks. It is steep, isolated, and entirely dependent on the weather. To be sent to a wadi is to be sent away from human engineering, away from city wells, away from the markets, and away from civilization itself. But the geography is only the first layer. The real discovery happens when you look at the original language. When you look at the Hebrew name of the brook itself, the name is Karath, or Cherith. It comes directly from the Hebrew root word Karath. Karath is a powerful, deliberate, and almost violent verb in the Hebrew language. It means to cut off, to sever, or to carve down. In the ancient world, you would use this word when cutting down a tree, when severing a branch from a vine, or when carving away dead wood. When you understand the root meaning of this word, the narrative suddenly opens up. God did not just send Elijah to a place of hiding. He sent him to the place of severing. God sent his prophet to the carving block. Look at the profound irony of what is happening in the story. Elijah has just walked into the royal court and cut off the water supply of the entire nation. He has severed the economy. He has cut off Ahab's power and publicly humiliated the false gods of the state. But as soon as the prophet cuts off the nation, God sends him to the brook Cherith. God sends him to the brook of severing to cut something away from the prophet. This reveals the quiet architecture of how God forms a human heart. We tend to think of God's preparation as a process of addition. We assume God prepares us by giving us more wisdom, more resources, more influence, and more visibility. We think of preparation as gathering tools for the mission. But in the biblical pattern, preparation is almost always a process of subtraction. Before God gives unprecedented public authority, he requires profound private severing. He cuts away our reliance on our own strength. He severs our addiction to the applause of the crowd. He carves down our ego until there is nothing left but absolute, quiet dependence on his word. Elijah had the spiritual authority to call down a national drought, but power without deep humility is incredibly dangerous. If Elijah had stayed in Israel, watching the skies dry up, watching the king panic, and watching his own prophecy come to pass, it would have been very easy for him to begin thinking the power belonged to him. He could have easily become the center of his own story. So God carves him down. He removes the audience. He removes the momentum. He places the prophet in an isolated ravine, sitting entirely alone, with nothing to do but listen to the water flowing over the rocks. The Brook Cherith was not just a safe house. It was a divine workshop. But sitting by that brook, Elijah faced a massive physical problem. Remember what a wadi is. It relies entirely on rain. Elijah is sitting next to a water source that is only sustained by the very rain he just prayed to stop. He is hiding in a place that is inevitably going to dry up. He has no food, no agriculture, and no way to survive on his own. If God is going to keep his prophet alive, he will have to do it supernaturally. God promises to feed him. But the way God chooses to deliver that food is one of the most shocking details in the entire Old Testament. God is about to send a messenger to keep the prophet alive. But he chooses a messenger that, according to the ancient laws of Israel, was strictly forbidden. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 4. God tells Elijah, "You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." To a modern reader, a raven is just a bird. We might picture a highly intelligent creature, or think of an old piece of literature. We read this verse and think of it as a charming, almost magical moment, nature serving the prophet. But to an ancient Israelite, a raven was not charming. It was a theological problem. If you go back to the book of Leviticus, chapter 11, you will find the dietary laws given to the people of Israel. The text explicitly lists the birds that are considered ritually unclean. These were birds the people were strictly forbidden to eat, and in many cases, forbidden to touch. Right there, in the middle of the list, is the raven. Ravens are scavengers. They are birds of carrion. They survive by picking at the remains of the dead. Because they associate with dead bodies, they carried the stain of death and were categorized as unclean. An observant, devout Israelite would never want to eat meat that had been carried in the beak of a scavenger. And yet, this is the exact creature God chooses to use. Look at the tension Elijah is sitting in. He is fighting for the absolute purity of Israel's worship. He has just risked his life to stand against the corrupt, pagan practices of the royal court. He is a holy prophet, defending the holy laws of God. And the holy God of Israel is dropping his daily meals from the mouth of a ritually impure bird. Why would God do this? Why not send a dove? Why not send an angel, as he actually does later in Elijah's life? Because God is doing something deliberate to the prophet's categories. Elijah had drawn a very strict line between the pure and the impure, between the righteous and the wicked. He knew the rules. But at the Brook of Severing, God is showing Elijah that his sovereignty extends far beyond the prophet's religious boxes. If God can command the unclean raven to do his will, God's authority is absolute. He is not limited by the tidy systems Elijah has constructed in his mind. There is also a profound irony in the nature of the raven itself. In ancient literature, and even in other parts of the Bible, ravens are notorious for being selfish creatures. The book of Job and the Psalms both mention young ravens crying out to God for food. Ancient observers noted that ravens often neglected their own young. They were known as birds that would barely feed their own offspring, let alone a creature of another species. Yet, God commands a bird that naturally hoards food, a bird that naturally neglects its own, to faithfully hand over meat to a human being. God is showing Elijah that the natural world, even the chaotic, unclean, and selfish parts of it, bows completely to the word of the Lord. Baal is supposed to be the god of nature, but Baal cannot even make it rain. The God of Israel, however, can make a scavenger serve a holy prophet. Elijah is learning a devastatingly beautiful lesson. God's provision does not always come in a pure, comfortable, or expected package. Sometimes, God sustains his people, using the very things they would normally avoid. But there is another layer to this miracle. The most striking detail about these ravens is not just that they are unclean. It is the specific schedule they keep. The rhythm of their delivery is not random. It is a deliberate, unmistakable echo of the oldest, most foundational memory of the people of Israel. Look closely at the exact schedule God sets for Elijah's meals. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 6, gives us a very specific detail. It says the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. On the surface, this just looks like a standard feeding schedule, breakfast and dinner. But in biblical literature, details like this are rarely accidental. When you read the words, bread and meat, delivered specifically in the morning and in the evening, it should trigger a massive theological memory. To find the origin of this exact phrase, you have to go all the way back to the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 16, the people of Israel have just been delivered from slavery in Egypt. They are standing in the wilderness, and they are out of food. They begin to panic, crying out to Moses, convinced they are going to starve in the desert. And God responds by making a promise. He tells Moses that he will rain down bread from heaven. But notice the specific way God delivers this provision. Exodus chapter 16, verse 12. God says, "At twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, quail came and covered the camp. The next morning, manna appeared on the desert floor. Meat in the evening, bread in the morning. This was the foundational rhythm of God's provision for the people of Israel. And now, hundreds of years later, sitting alone by a rocky ravine, Elijah is being placed on the exact same diet. God is putting his prophet through a miniature exodus. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the purpose of manna. Manna was not just a way to keep people from starving. It was a daily spiritual discipline. The rule of manna was that you could only gather enough for one day. If you tried to hoard it, if you tried to store it in a jar to guarantee you had food for tomorrow, the text says it would breed worms and rot overnight. God designed it this way intentionally. He was teaching a nation of former slaves how to trust him. He was forcing them to live in a posture of daily, active dependence. Every night, they went to sleep with empty hands. Every morning, they had to trust that the provider would still be there. This is exactly what is happening to Elijah at the brook. Elijah is an incredibly powerful prophet. He has just spoken a word that stopped the rain across an entire nation. But God knows that a prophet who does not know how to depend on God daily will eventually destroy himself with his own power. So God places him in a situation where hoarding is impossible. Elijah cannot freeze the meat. He cannot preserve the bread. He cannot negotiate with the ravens for a weekly delivery. Every single night, the prophet goes to sleep with absolutely no food for the next day. He has to wake up, look at the sky, and trust that the unclean birds will return. Pause for a second and look at what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random sequence of survival tactics. Every element of the brook is a deliberate tool of formation. The ravine is severing his pride. The unclean ravens are expanding his theology. And the morning and evening deliveries are forcing him into the rhythm of daily trust. God is carefully, systematically remaking the inner architecture of his prophet. But bread and meat are only part of the equation. A human being can survive for a long time on daily food, but they cannot survive without water. And while the ravens were operating on a faithful, miraculous schedule, the water at Cherith was operating by a completely different set of rules. The hardest test at the brook was not the arrival of the ravens. It was what was slowly, inevitably happening to the stream. 1 Kings, chapter 17, verse 7, contains one of the most chilling and realistic sentences in the entire story of Elijah. It simply says, "Sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land." Just pause and imagine the slow psychological weight of that verse. Elijah is living under the covering of a profound daily miracle. Every morning, the ravens bring bread and meat. Every evening, they return. The food is supernatural, but the water is not. The water is completely natural, and the water is failing. A wadi does not dry up overnight. It is not a sudden, dramatic event. It is a slow, agonizing regression. Day after day, Elijah watches the water level drop. The sound of the rushing stream turns into a quiet babble. The babble turns into a slow trickle. The trickle separates into isolated, standing pools. The pools slowly evaporate into wet mud, and finally, the mud hardens into cracked, dry earth. And during this entire process, as the life-saving water slowly disappears, the heavens are entirely silent. God does not speak. God does not send a sudden rain cloud just for the prophet. God lets the brook fail. This introduces a profound theological tension into the story. Why is the brook drying up? The text is very clear. It dried up because there had been no rain in the land. But why was there no rain? Because Elijah prayed that it would stop. Elijah is caught in the physical consequences of his own prophetic obedience. We often assume that if we obey God, we will be completely insulated from the collateral damage of a broken world. We assume the messenger gets a pass. But the text shows something very different. God did not exempt Elijah from the drought. When a prophet speaks a hard word over a nation, the prophet still has to live in that nation. Elijah had to feel the physical weight of the reality he announced. But there is an even deeper layer to the drying brook. Remember, God is omniscient. When God originally directed Elijah to the Karath ravine, God already knew the water was going to fail. God intentionally sent his prophet to a temporary source of provision. Why would God do that? Why not send him to a deep, underground spring that would never run dry? Because human nature has a dangerous tendency. When God provides for us in a specific way for a long enough time, we subtly stop trusting the provider and start trusting the provision. If the brook never dried up, Elijah would have eventually put his faith in the water. He would have made a permanent camp at Cherith. He would have stopped looking at the sky and started looking only at the stream. So God allowed the method of provision to fail. Not because God was abandoning his prophet, but because God was preparing to move him. The drying of the brook was not a sign of God's absence. It was the necessary condition for God's next command. As long as there was water in the ravine, Elijah would never leave. The comfort of the brook had to die, so the prophet could be forced back into the open. But imagine sitting by that shrinking stream, watching the water disappear, waiting for a word from God, and hearing nothing. Elijah had to wait until the absolute last drop was gone, before the silence was broken. And when the word of the Lord finally comes, the instruction God gives is even more shocking than the unclean ravens. God is about to send his prophet out of the wilderness, but he is not sending him back to Israel. He is sending him directly into the heart of enemy territory. Elijah is sitting by the dry riverbed. The water is gone. The text does not tell us how many days he sat there looking at the mud. But finally, the silence breaks. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Notice the specific timing. The word of the Lord does not come while the water is flowing. It does not come when the brook is half empty. It comes only after the provision has completely failed. God waited until the old season was definitively over before he revealed the new one. This is a vital pattern in the way God forms his people. When a season of provision ends, our natural human instinct is to stay by the dry brook. We try to dig out the mud. We wait for the water to return. We become deeply attached to the method God used to sustain us, instead of the God who actually did the sustaining. If God had spoken any earlier, Elijah might have tried to negotiate. He had to see the absolute end of Cherith before he was completely ready to leave it. And when God finally speaks, the instruction is breathtaking. Verse 9. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. To a modern reader, this is just another spot on the map. But to an ancient Israelite, this command is absolutely staggering. Zarephath is not in Israel. It is in the region of Sidon. Sidon is a Phoenician territory on the Mediterranean coast. Why does that matter? Because Sidon is the absolute epicenter of Baal worship. It is the geographical stronghold of the storm god. Even worse, the king of Sidon is a man named Ethbaal, and Ethbaal is the father of Queen Jezebel. God is not sending Elijah to a safe, quiet village in the mountains of Judah. God is sending his most wanted prophet directly into the hometown of the queen who wants him dead. He is sending the prophet of Yahweh straight into the theological headquarters of the God he is actively mocking. It is enemy territory. It is the heart of the darkness. But the geography is only half of the shock. Look at who God has chosen to be the next provider. At the brook, God used ritually unclean scavengers. In Sidon, God says he has appointed a widow to supply the food. In the ancient Near East, a widow without a grown son was the most economically vulnerable person in society. She had no safety net. She had no real rights to property. She was the one who was supposed to receive charity, not the one who provided it. If you are a fugitive prophet needing a safe house and a steady supply of food during a severe famine, a foreign widow is the absolute last person you would rely on. And yet, this is exactly where the God of Israel sends his man. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random sequence of survival tactics. The pattern is becoming deeply consistent. God is actively dismantling Elijah's reliance on human strength, human logic, and conventional power. He stripped away his audience at the royal court. He stripped away his comfort at the rocky wadi. He challenged his religious categories with the ravens. He broke his self-reliance with the drying water. And now, he is stripping away his cultural safety by sending him to a destitute Gentile woman in the capital of Baal. God was preparing to move Elijah. But the journey to Zarephath would require the prophet to abandon every instinct of survival he had left. He was leaving the unclean birds to find an unlikely provider. But the woman he was about to meet was not hoarding a secret stockpile of food. When Elijah finally finds her, she is gathering sticks, preparing her final meal, and getting ready to die. Elijah walks nearly 100 miles. He travels from the hidden wadi east of the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean coast. He is walking through a landscape that he himself commanded to dry up. The journey is long, dangerous, and surrounded by famine. He finally reaches the gates of Zarephath. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 10. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He calls out to her and asks for a drink of water, and then a piece of bread. But listen to her response. Verse 12. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This is the woman God appointed to feed the greatest prophet of the age, not a wealthy merchant, not a hidden network of sympathizers, a starving Gentile widow gathering firewood for her final meal. If Elijah had any lingering reliance on human solutions, this moment completely shattered it. God promised a provider, but the provider had absolutely nothing left to give. Elijah then asks her to do something that sounds incredibly demanding. He tells her to go ahead and bake the bread, but to make a small loaf for him first. It is a staggering request. He is asking a starving mother to take the last morsel of food from her dying child and give it to a foreign stranger. But he follows the request with a prophetic promise. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: "The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The woman obeys, and the text says there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. Notice the beautiful, quiet, theological insult taking place in this house. Remember exactly where they are. They are in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon, the heartland of Baal. Baal is supposed to be the god of the rain, the grain, and the oil. His entire religious purpose was to guarantee the agricultural fertility of the land. But in Baal's own hometown, among his own people, the false god is completely silent. He cannot produce a single drop of rain. He cannot fill a single jar of flour. He cannot press a single drop of olive oil to save a starving widow. Right in the shadow of Baal's temples, the God of Israel is quietly hijacking the kitchen of a pagan widow and doing the exact thing Baal is powerless to do. He is keeping a widow, an orphan, and a fugitive prophet alive on a daily miracle. The raven and the widow are actually two halves of the exact same lesson. The ravens were ritually unclean. The widow was culturally and religiously an outsider. The ravens were known in the ancient world for neglecting their young. The widow was entirely powerless to feed her own son. Both were completely incapable of providing for a prophet, and both were used by God to do exactly that. Through the bird and the widow, God was carving a profound truth into Elijah's heart. God does not need ideal circumstances to sustain his word. He does not need purity, power, or human resources. He can use the marginalized, the broken, the unclean, and the empty to accomplish his will. Elijah had to learn this in the shadows. He had to master this lesson in the hiddenness of the wilderness and the quiet of a widow's kitchen. Because if he did not learn it here, he would never survive what was coming next. The hidden severing of chapter 17 was finally complete, and it was time to face the fire of chapter 18. 1 Kings chapter 18 contains one of the most famous showdowns in all of Scripture. Elijah stands on top of Mount Carmel. He is facing 450 prophets of Baal. He builds an altar, drenches it with water, and calls down fire from heaven. The fire falls, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil. The people fall on their faces and declare that the Lord is God. And then, after 3.5 years of agonizing drought, Elijah prays, and the sky turns black with heavy clouds. The rain finally returns. It is a moment of unparalleled spiritual victory. It is the kind of massive, undeniable breakthrough that every reader of the Bible wants to experience. We all want the fire of Mount Carmel. We want the public vindication. We want the moment when the rain finally breaks the long drought. But here is the central truth that the text demands we see. You cannot survive the heights of Mount Carmel if you have not been broken at the Brook Cherith. Chapter 18 is only possible because of chapter 17. If Elijah had gone straight from Ahab's court to the top of the mountain, the power would have destroyed him. He would have believed the fire fell because of his own righteousness. He would have believed the rain returned because of his own authority. He would have become a prophet who worshipped his own prophetic gift. So God took him into the wilderness and carved him down. At the Wadi of Severing, God cut away the audience. Through the unclean ravens, God stretched the prophet's theology and proved that his sovereignty has no limits. Through the slow, agonizing drying of the brook, God forced his prophet to stop trusting the provision and start trusting the provider. And through the starving widow in the heartland of Baal, God showed Elijah that divine power flows best through the deeply inadequate. By the time Elijah actually climbed Mount Carmel, he was not relying on himself. He was completely empty. And exactly because he was completely empty, God could entrust him with the kind of authority that brings fire from heaven. This is the quiet architecture of how God forms a human heart. When God is preparing to use someone publicly, he will almost always hide them privately. When God is preparing to give a new assignment, he will often allow the old brook to dry up. The failing of the water does not mean you have failed. It does not mean God has abandoned you. It means the season of hidden formation is doing its necessary work. We spend so much of our lives running from the dry riverbeds. We panic when the water stops flowing. We try to dig out the mud. We beg God to send the rain immediately. But Scripture invites us to trust the slow, deliberate work of the carving block. The wilderness is not an accident. It is the exact place where the most vital spiritual work is done. The story of Elijah's survival is not just a historical account of a prophet seeking shelter from a wicked king. It is a profound blueprint for everyone who has ever watched their provision dry up and wondered if God has forgotten them. He has not. He is preparing you for the mountain. The brook was never just a hiding place. It was the workshop of God.